How's it going? My name is Julius Thomas. I'm here with Scott Forbes. We've got a really exciting podcast episode today. We're going to talk a little bit about sports science, creatine, and really how do we take that information and a lot of the understandings that Scott has developed and observed over time to really optimize performance and wellness. So, episode 5 of the Expert Mind and Body podcast is happening right now. A little bit of brief introduction about our guest for today. Scott Forbes has a PhD in physical education and recreation, and his interests now are in sports science, exercise, and nutrition. Did I get it right?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Oh, perfect. Well, every time we have somebody on the podcast, we really like to get a little background about them. So let our audience members and our listeners kind of see you, who you are as a person in your journey. It's a great accomplishment to become a PhD, and we know it takes a lot of time, but it's also cool to see, how people got to that place. So you want to start off by, give us a little background about where you're from, and then maybe a little bit about your educational journey.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with my educational journey. I did my undergraduate degree and my master's at the University of Saskatchewan, which
Mm,
is also in the province of Saskatchewan. Um, and I was very fortunate there to work under the supervision of Dr. Phil Chillibeck, who's studies exercise metabolism and has done a lot of research looking at nutrition and the interaction with exercise
yep.
on a variety of different populations. And my master's was actually working with para-Nordic cross-country skiers. So
You got to
we
explain
went out,
paranordic. What's paranordic
yeah,
mean?
para-Nordic. So they they essentially they couldn't walk,
Oh,
so they had spinal cord injuries,
wow.
and they would sit in a specialized chair that was attached to a pair of cross-country skis,
Hmm.
and they would cross-country ski around, and it was absolutely phenomenal. And
Absolutely.
some of these individuals were extremely fit, so it was pretty cool to watch and to test them and to work with that population.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to have to remember that. I'm currently doing a rotation, a rehabilitation hospital, and we have some spinal cord injury patients. So I'm going to definitely have to use that as something that I can remind them of that's possible and the different things you can do, even with some of those disabilities. So, man, I'm already learning good things. So
Yeah,
yeah,
so
continue.
so that was my master's, and it was pretty cool. I got to go out to the Rocky Mountains in Alberta
Yep.
and conduct some research there, which is a beautiful part of Canada. If you ever get up to Canada, you got to check out the Rocky Mountains. It's
Noted.
phenomenal.
Noted.
Um, so after that, I actually started my PhD, and I was interested in sport nutrition, and so I studied a single amino acid called L-arginine,
Hmm.
which is it, it, it's popular in sports supplements to enhance nitric oxide, which is supposed to enhance vasodilation, so make your arteries
Yep.
bigger
Yep.
and give you that pump.
Hmm.
But we actually found in even a very high dose of L-arginine that it did not enhance any form of exercise, so whether it was aerobic exercise or resistance exercise, and it actually did not increase nitric oxide in young, healthy, athletic populations. So there is some evidence that in people with hypertension or older adults, it could be a benefit. But in young athletes, L-arginine is not an effective supplement to enhance exercise performance. So that
Mm-hmm.
was my PhD,
Yep.
and then I went on and did a postdoctoral fellowship, and I did that actually at the uh, in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Calgary,
Hmm.
and I studied the impacts of exercise and nutrition on cognition. So that was kind of my first introduction into brain health. And it's pretty cool because a lot of things that I study in sport, a lot of different supplements, for example, they could potentially have some impact on your brain and also what makes you a better athlete. For example, exercise, resistance training, things like that can also have an impact on your brain as well, which is pretty cool. So I
It
started
is.
to get introduced into that area,
Hmm.
and I was also kind of interested in creatine supplementation throughout my studies as well.
Yep.
And I got connected with this guy named Dr. Darren Kandow, and he's a kind of world-renowned creatine researcher. And we've been studying creatine for a variety of different populations.
Oh yeah.
Um,
That sounds
so
really good. We're definitely gonna take a deep dive into that creatine topic later on in the episode. I mean, number one because of your expertise, and two because creatine is such a popular supplement, and I'm sure our listeners would enjoy hearing a little bit about that. So, tell me, so what are your hobbies? What is Dr. Forbes like? When he's not wearing the lab coat or working as a professor.
yeah, so I have two young kids, and so I love just kind of hanging out with them. But I also play this obscure kayaking sport,
Hmm.
and so it's called canoe polo, but it's played in kayaks. So you got to check it out.
Canoe
And
polo. How big of a body of water is this played on?
so it's typically played in. You can play it indoors or outdoors. It's 20. The pitch is 25 meters wide
Hmm.
by 30 meters long.
Wow.
So you need a pretty big pool.
Yep, yep, yep. What I'm thinking.
And yeah, it's played 5-on-5, and the nets are actually suspended 2 meters above the water, and it's just a rectangle. It's a meter by a meter and a half,
Yep,
and the goalie holds up their paddle to try to knock down the ball,
yep.
and essentially you just paddle in your kayak. You can catch the ball, and you try to throw it in the opponent's net. And
Ah, so you
yeah,
got
so I'm actually going to Edmonton next week to compete in a kayak polo competition.
see, that's exciting, and that's why one of the benefits of having somebody from Canada on the podcast is we get to talk about things that I'm sure most of us in the states are unfamiliar with. And I can see why you do it indoors because I imagine it's a little bit difficult to find non-frozen bodies of water in Canada come winter months.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct on that.
Which season do you prefer? Do you prefer the indoor or the outdoor?
Um, I enjoy both, but indoors a little bit easier. There's less wind and things like that to deal with.
I thought you were going to say cold.
No, the cold's not a problem.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense since you live up there in Canada. Well, how about we jump into our first topic? Um, Talk to me about sports science. When you hear the word sports science, what are the first things that come to mind?
Yeah, so I think just trying to enhance exercise performance. And when I think about sports science, it's obviously applying science and what we know through published research, for example, or uh, observations, and applying that to a sporting situation.
Hmm.
So I always try to think about, for example, canoe polo. How can I use science to enhance athletic performance in that particular sport or any other sport? So that's where I see kind of what sports science is it's using what we know from the academic world and trying to translate that into an actual sporting environment, which I think there's often a disconnect between those two. But I think it's getting better, and I think more organizations are seeing the benefits of sports science. And yeah, I think people are understanding the true benefits of it.
And that's interesting. You brought up a couple of points that I want to talk about a little bit. You said trying and the difficulty of applying, kind of what we've observed in research to an actual performance setting. So, in your experience, what are some of those difficulties, or what makes you use that word "trying" as part of your way to describe how we apply sports science?
Yeah. So when we conduct a research study, obviously it's usually on a group of individuals, and we usually look at the group means. So on average, what is an intervention doing to that group? So
Hmm.
whether it's a supplement, creatine, or some sort of unique exercise intervention. But we know not every individual is responding the same to that particular treatment. So I
Mm,
think we need to be cautious in applying that in a sporting situation, because just saying that, a supplement worked in this research setting, it's now going to work in a field, in a sports situation, is not always correct. So we need to be cautious about that. And then oftentimes in research, we try to control as many variables as possible to try to isolate one independent variable.
mhm,
So, for example, a lot of the research that we conduct, for example, we'll do the testing, for example, in a fasted state, which
mm,
means that you get no breakfast in the morning, and um, we want to see the effects of like the supplements.
yep,
And the reason why we do that is because we don't want people eating different breakfasts, because that can have an effect on the performance, for example. And so we try to control all those things. But in the real world, people would eat breakfast.
yeah, yeah.
So applying sometimes the research studies into the real world is not always perfect.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense because you want to see what effect that supplement is having on the body and on the performance. But if they've all had different breakfasts, there's so many different nutrients, and those supplements may be a part of those nutrients that now have an effect on the effect of the supplement in the body.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's you just again, I think you just need to be cautious in applying the a research study into the real world. But the more research studies we can do, and the more information that you have, I think you're more competent to ultimately apply that to a sports setting.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about how you do that. When you keep in mind that what you found in a research setting may there may be some difficulties in applying that into the performance setting. So when you're designing programs for different populations, how do you overcome that?
Yeah, so I think it's important for the individual to experiment with themselves and try these things out in training. It's like the golden rule is in sport nutrition is that you don't do something on competition day that's different from what you've done on all of your training days.
Hmm.
So you need to practice what you are trying to do. So if you're thinking about creatine supplementation, for example, I wouldn't try that on a game day or a competition day. I would try that in perhaps the off season to start. And then if it's working, if it seems to be effective, then you can apply it in more competitive situations. But I think it's important for athletes to, yeah, to try these things out on themselves and try to monitor as many variables as possible. Maybe get in touch with a qualified sports scientist to monitor some of those things, and yeah, you can really see the effect on yourself, because ultimately that's what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I think that's a key difference between research and an athlete's perspective of why it's important to utilize something like sports science. Because when you have an N of one, it's much different than having an N of the it varies to depending on those population sizes. So what they found works really good for that group. Does it work for me? And how do I incorporate that into my training or into my competition? So I know that you've done some working with teams. Can you give us an example of maybe a program or a supplement that you've started to try to help a team use to increase their performance?
Yeah, so again, from a training perspective, I try to keep things relatively simple.
Hmm.
And I know there's some great trainers out there that do very complex training, but I always try to keep things as simple as possible but sustainable. I think consistency in training is more important than people give it credit for.
Yeah.
If you can just train hard and consistent, you can go a long ways. And I think people forget that, and they try to do super unique, advanced training, and then it's too difficult, and then they train for a week and then take a week off. And so consistency is super important.
Yep.
With regards to nutrition standpoint, I was watching a video by this great professor. His name's Dr. Jose Antonio, and he gave some very simple advice with regards to sport nutrition. And essentially, the foundation is he called it 3-2-1. So you need he broke down the macronutrients. So we have three macronutrients: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins.
Yep.
But the 3-2-1 is you need 3 grams of per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrates, 2 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein, and 1 gram per kilogram of body weight of fat. So I love that analogy because 3-2-1 is just so simple.
Yep.
And that's the foundation. And then from there, you can adjust based off context. So if
Hmm.
you're doing lots of high intensity exercise, you could increase the amount of carbohydrates in the diet.
Hmm.
If you're in a caloric deficit, for example, and you're trying to build muscle, you can increase the amount of protein even above 2 grams per kilogram of body weight, maybe up to 2.4 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein to increase muscle mass while you're in a caloric deficit. So you can adjust those things um, based off context, but the starting point, the foundation is that 3-2-1, and it's so simple. And I think if anyone's interested in sport nutrition, that's a great place to start.
No, yeah. I mean, one thing that really stands out to me so much is how sports science is changing the way athletes go about what they do. When I first started playing sports, there was no recommendations of 3-2-1. Um, I mean, ask the right coach, water was optional, and it's really, changing how well athletes are able to sustain their bodies and their health. But um, in an actual athlete setting, how much application do you see athletes utilizing some of the sports science as far as nutrition, and does that change at different levels? One thing I'm not as familiar with is I used to be is especially something like high school sports. Are high school athletes really utilizing some of these nutritional guidelines or guidance?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And even the 3-2-1, you still have to obviously monitor your eating. You'd have to input it into some sort of software to get your macronutrient breakdown. And all those things are time consuming and a bit of a challenge for sure. So there's other ways to look at um, kind of what you're eating and give kind of even simpler recommendations. So
Hmm.
the US Olympic Committee has actually developed athlete plates. And so it's like how much of your plate should be whole grains or how much should be uh, protein, a good protein source, or how much should be fruits and vegetables, for example, and how that should change from an easy training day to a hard training day.
No.
So there's it's even breaks it down, which I think is useful, especially for young athletes or individuals that don't have the time to track all their macronutrients.
Yep.
They could just kind of look at these. Okay, how should my plate be set up,
Yep.
and uh, and then you can apply it in that situation. So I think, yeah, I think there's definitely challenges to applying that sports science, especially those numbers and those recommendations, to the real world.
Yep.
Again, I would recommend that somebody seek out a qualified sport nutritionist,
Yep.
whether they're certified with ISSN, for example, to really hone in on some of those numbers and applying it to a real world.
Yeah. And so the next thing that comes to my mind, obviously, is coaches, right? Coaches, they have the power and they have the control in the sports setting. What type of reception have you gotten from coaches? And what has their perspective been on utilizing sports science with their teams?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I think you need to develop a bit of rapport with the coaches. That's more important than what people give it credit for.
Yeah.
So you need to basically prove to the coaches that this is developed by science, and we need to trust science, and that it can enhance exercise performance. So I think if you develop a good rapport with the coach, then you're more likely to translate that science into the real world. But yeah, it depends on the coach for sure. And yeah, there's some coaches that would tell you that you don't have to drink any water, or there's hydration's not important. It's good to stress your body, or For example, they might tell females, for example, that yeah, if they're not like not menstruating, that's perfectly fine, and just try to lose weight, eat less calories. But we know that that could have a huge detrimental effect on their performance. So yeah, there's bad coaches out there,
Yeah.
and I think we need to seek out qualified sport nutritionists.
No, I think that's important, and that's really great information. I like the 2 points that you kind of brought up just to summarize them. Number one, for anybody that's working in a sport environment, understanding that that rapport with the coach is so important. That relationship is really going to provide whatever expert that opportunity to really allow their information and what they've studied to be applied into that setting. But there's also a safety and health perspective, and coaches have so much on their plate, and ultimately they're responsible for the performance of that team, but they can leverage health professionals to really help them take care of their players, or maybe something, like we talked about, for example, drinking water during practice. And there's this antiquated idea of, maybe drinking water is weakness. We need to be able to practice without having that hydration. But then to have somebody that's trained in sports nutrition to come in and say, hey, let me tell you how the body is utilizing the water. And this is going to help your players throughout the season, really is, the way I think about it, a way to help the players. And when you have people with advanced degrees that really understand the basic science, they're there and they have the ability to help athletes maintain their long term health and really increase that optimization throughout their careers.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was put perfectly. Yeah, especially with water. We know that when you sweat, and if you lose more than 2% of your body weight from sweat, that impairs exercise performance. But there was also a recent systematic review that looked at lo- losing more than 2% of your body weight through dehydration, through sweating, that it also impacts your brain as well. So your ability to make decisions or process information is impaired because of dehydration.
Wow.
So those things are obviously important, especially in a sporting environment.
Yeah, well, I'm one of the biggest fans of sports science. I'm excited to see sports science grow. I know that as an athlete, not saying that I would have taken all the recommendations, but to have that implemented into that team environment, I think is super important. So let's talk about creatine. I know that this is an area of emphasis and study for you, something you're excited about. So, give our audience, just some introductory understanding of what you know about creatine and why it's important, and then we'll just kind of dive in and have some good conversation about it.
Yeah, so first of all, there are very few supplements that are effective. And before you even, I think, consider creatine supplementation, it's important to have a good, healthy diet. And it's also important to exercise regularly. So
Doctor's
if you're
order.
doing those two things first, then you've kind of set the foundation. And then
Yeah.
you can think about, other things, maybe protein or protein timing or creatine supplementation. So creatine is, yeah, I've done a lot of research on it, and it's made up of three amino acids: arginine, glycine, and methionine. And it's found in foods as well, things like red meat, chicken, and also seafood. So things like herring or cod or salmon.
It's good to hear.
But yeah, so if you either eat those types of foods and or supplement with a creatine supplement, you can increase the amount of creatine in your muscle. And we know that that can enhance muscle performance, but creatine is also in your brain as well. And we know that if you supplement with creatine, you can increase the amount of creatine within your brain, and that could also impact cognitive processing, which is phenomenal and
Yeah.
pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, anytime we have a chance to take a supplement or increase certain foods in our diet, it gives our muscles the ability to perform at their highest level, then also works in the brain. It sounds like a win-win for me. So, what are the most exciting things for you about creatine, or what are the two things that you're most interested in investigating?
Yeah, so I think we need to look at a dose response
Mm,
with regards to how much creatine do we need to get that brain effect.
yep.
We have well established data at the muscle level that you can actually consume a fairly low amount of creatine. So they've actually shown if you consume 3 grams per day, you can saturate your muscles within about 28 days.
Mm,
So most supplements you'll buy, and it tells you you have to do that loading phase of 20 grams a day for 5 days, and then you take 5 grams after that per day. But we know that if you just take 3 grams per day, you can actually get about a 20% increase in the amount of creatine within your muscle, and your muscle will be fully saturated.
wow.
At the brain level, we don't know whether taking more creatine or less creatine is going to make a difference. So I think that's an important question to answer right now. And then I would say looking at the effects of creatine in a female population is important.
Absolutely.
Um, we know that females actually have higher amounts of creatine within their muscle, and so they might be less responsive to creatine supplementation. And I think that's yeah, and also there's hormonal differences that can influence the enzyme involved in creatine metabolism. But there's been very little research looking at creatine in females, so I think that's an area that needs to be addressed.
No, I mean, I think you brought up a really important point outside of what specifically we were talking about with creatine, but looking at sex specific interactions with performance training supplementation. You know, a lot of people have brought up, you know, that not being able to specifically look at females and looking at how their bodies are responding to training loads or supplements is a area that with a lot of potential for research, so we can really make sure that, you know, the recommendations that we give out, they're not just male specific. So I think that's a great point. But I also think that anytime you're talking about any supplement, you know, that first thought comes into your mind of skepticism or the wariness. And have you found any negative aspects from supplementing with creatine? Because I think that that might be important for the listeners. And we call them the weekend warriors, but our average everyday exercises that are looking to implement sports science information into their weekly routines, but want to do it safely.
Yeah, so creatine is one of the safest supplements on the market, and there's a lot of evidence to support the safety profile of creatine. There are some people that don't respond well to creatine. They might have a bit of bloating or nausea. And for those individuals, I would usually recommend that lower dose because we know that it's effective and it's going to increase the creatine within the muscle. So you don't have to do that big loading phase.
Hmm.
And so that usually eliminates some of those individual side effects that are quite rare. So it is a very safe supplement. We do know that it's not going to harm your kidneys
That's
or
good.
uh, do anything of that nature. It's not going to cause baldness, even though I'm not a good advocate for this. But yeah, there was a study in rugby players where they showed an increased conversion of testosterone to dihydrotestosterone or
Wow. Wow.
DHT.
Yeah.
And DHT has been linked to male pattern baldness.
Mm,
So a lot of people suggest that creatine causes baldness, but if you look at that study closely, the changes weren't beyond physiological um, ranges. So it wasn't like creatine was causing this massive increase in DHT. And if you actually look at the
yeah.
placebo group went down, whereas the creatine group didn't really change over time. So at the end of it, they said creatine caused this, but I don't think creatine actually causes baldness.
We like to call it in sports that was a reach. You know, they reached on that one, but I'm sure it made
Yeah.
the article more compelling. Um, is there a way for an individual to measure how much their baseline creatine levels are in their muscle? We talk about, you know, you talked about, excuse me, the dose dependent relationship between creatine and an individual, not a group or a norm. So, are could I go out and find out how much creatine is currently in my muscles before I start doing creatine supplementation?
Accurately, no, unless you take a muscle biopsy.
Oh, no, thanks.
Um, yeah, which I've done a few of those, and you don't want to do those too often.
Yeah,
But one of the, I guess, side effects with creatine is that it does draw water into the muscle. And that's actually an important part of the process to stimulate muscle growth.
hmm,
So a lot of people think that, oh, it's just going to make watery, puffy muscles,
yeah,
but that's actually stimulating um, the muscle to grow. So
yeah,
it's an important part. But typically, with that, you're going to gain a little bit of water weight.
yep,
And so that's one way to potentially tell if creatine is causing an effect within your body and if you're getting it within the muscles because it will bring water into the muscle. So if you measure your weight and you take creatine for 5 days and you measure your weight again and it's gone up a little bit, it could be associated with the effectiveness of creatine.
yeah.
But again, at the end of the day, it's very challenging to find out if you actually have more creatine within your muscles without taking a muscle biopsy.
Yeah, and I often talk about sports science, and I I bring up, as we're able to peek inside the body, and the better and better we get at creating the devices to measure what's happening underneath the skin, it's really going to open up the field of sports science to really be able to tease out and recommend, that individual specific information for, what might be a little bit low, what might be a little bit high. So I think the future is very bright for sports science, and it's going to continue to help athletes and individuals live healthier lives. But speaking of individuals and healthy lives and lifespan, I know you've done some work with older adults, and I really wanted to talk about that population because number one, it's growing, but number two, we're all going to be older adults one day. So, can you tell us a little bit about some of the work you've done with older adults?
Yeah, so we've done quite a few resistance training and supplementation studies with older adults, primarily to enhance muscle mass and strength, but also functionality. And we've also looked at the impacts of those exercise interventions and supplementation on bone health as well.
Oh, that's important.
But yeah, in the older population, we know that you lose what's called your type 2 muscle fibers
Hmm.
or your fast twitch muscle fibers. And that makes it more difficult to do explosive or power type activities.
Yeah.
And it's why if you're 70 years old, you're not going to be able to sprint as fast as you were when you're 20 or 30 years old
Yep.
because of that atrophy and loss of those type 2 fibers. So I think what we've shown is that if you perform resistance training, that you can preserve some of those type 2 fibers. And we also know that as you age, you typically consume less protein as well.
Hmm.
And protein is really important for maintaining, preserving, and building muscle. And so I think those are two really important considerations for aging individuals is to resistance train. It's has huge effects, and it's really really important to maintain our health and longevity,
Yep.
and also consume a higher protein diet as we age as well. That's a really important consideration.
Yeah. So, resistance training and the right supplementation is going to help you preserve the bone and the muscle, which are two really important parts about the aging process. So, one of the questions that comes to mind for me is when you're working with older adults, what are the concerns they bring up? What are the things that they're coming or the information they're seeking from you to help them just function and live better daily lives?
Yeah, so I think one of the limitations is that they feel uncomfortable in like a gym setting. So
Mm,
trying to incorporate resistance training either in a home-based setting, I think would be really important, or giving them the confidence to go to a weight room and whether it's utilizing machine weights, for example, which are a little bit easier and safer, and it builds confidence,
mhm.
and it's also effective as well. So things like that is a concern. And then the other thing is they often don't like supplements as well. So even though we know, for example, that consuming more protein is a benefit, it's a challenge to encourage older individuals to consume more protein in their diet. So we have to come up with food first approaches and different strategies to encourage those things.
Yeah, and again, my mind. I have another question. I often think of resistance training as cleans, squats, bench press. Can you talk a little bit about what resistance training is like for older adults? Is it the same as I just mentioned, or is it different? And are there different adaptations to better fit that population?
Yeah, so it could mean a variety of things. It could mean simply like walking up a set of stairs slowly,
Wow.
could be a form of resistance training.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be in a weight room, it doesn't have to be complicated. But that being said, to help preserve those type 2 fibers, there's actually a growing body of literature to show that high or higher velocity resistance training could be a benefit for aging individuals. So I'm not suggesting that they go and perform cleans and really advanced kind of Olympic lifts,
Yeah.
but performing resistance training uh, at a little bit higher velocity could have some great benefit, particularly on those fast twitch fibers.
No, yeah, that's really good to think about because often, the mind just goes to, your own personal experience and thinking about something as simple as utilizing a staircase to really help older adults to be able to maintain those type 2 muscle fibers. But then also, a lot of older adults have stairs in their home, and the ability to be able to make it up and down the stairs becomes more of a concern as we age. So that provides a great opportunity to help them, one, maintain their muscle, but also have increased safety in their home.
Absolutely. Yeah. It doesn't have to be complicated.
Yeah, and I think that that's kind of like a summary of everything that you've been really teaching and talking to us about today. Is how do we make this simple? Sports science is complex, and what's happening within the body and how we apply that to optimal performance. Yeah, but let the researchers and let the qualified sports nutritionists or PhDs kind of strain through the complexity. But then when we deliver it, let's deliver it in a package that really works for that specific population and setting.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly what we have to do.
That's great. So the first thing is, like we said, taking sports science and taking some really complex understandings and research and making it digestible for that specific population. Then the importance of adequate amount of supplementation, and specifically with creatine, that has a lot of great research to support it. Also, is one of the safest supplements. And then, some cool things we can do for older adults and ourselves to have in mind as we think about aging. But before I let you go, I always ask every guest to give one tip, something that the listeners can just really take in to utilize to help increase their own wellness. And so, what would that be from Dr. Forbes?
Yeah, so that's a tricky one for me because most people think I'm going to say creatine,
Ah,
um, but I'm going to say I, you're going to have to hit what I call your sledgehammers. So I'm not
sledgehammer.
going to give you just one. I'm going to give you a couple. So
I'll take it.
these are really important things to enhance health and wellness and could be applied to athletes or older individuals. But you need to, number one, eat real food. Number two, exercise regularly. And number three, you need sufficient sleep. If you hit those three things, you're going to be a much healthier individual, whether you're an athlete or an older adult.
And I think that's really important. I do a lot of research, and I really study the literature of healthy lifestyle behaviors. And sometimes, we can get in the weeds of confusing optimal performance with what it takes to be healthy. And I like to say that, the human body, it really just needs moderate wellness. Now, if you want to go be a world class basketball player or downhill skier, like, okay, now we're going to have to do some things differently. But if you want to maintain health and wellness across the lifespan, it can be really simple. And so I love your tips. Eat real food, regular exercise, and sufficient sleep is really going to go a long ways of, I mean, number one, keeping healthy body strength, but also just to reduce the risk of illness as you age as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are the sledgehammers, the things that are going to have a big impact on your health, and it's supported by a lot of science.
Man, that's amazing. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming on and just giving our listeners a glimpse into some of the topics in a large field of sports science, sharing your research, your experience, and then leaving us with the sledgehammers. That was great. So hopefully we'll have you on again. And thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me, and happy to be here.
All right.